Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
In the mid-1980s, under the washed-out lights of a federal courtroom in Manhattan, an aging man with a damaged eye sat at the defense table, while prosecutors described him as one of the most influential organized crime figures in New York. On paper, he was a decorated veteran of the Second World War, a successful restaurateur, a businessman with interests that stretched from Times Square to the suburbs of Connecticut. In the indictment, he was something very different, a central figure in the Genovese crime family, quietly shaping what happened in nightclubs, trucking companies, waste disposal firms, labor unions, and a constellation of bars and adult entertainment venues. Reporters knew him by a nickname that sounded almost larger than life: Matty the Horse. The jurors saw a compact, neatly dressed man in his 60s, expression controlled, listening as his long career was recast as a lattice of racketeering schemes and hidden ownerships. Between those two images, veteran and racketeer, family man and feared enforcer, lay the story of a New Yorker shaped by poverty, prejudice, war, and a city whose underworld grew up alongside its skyscrapers. To understand how that man ended up in that courtroom, we have to wind the clock back to a very different New York, and to a boy born into its crowded tenements at the start of the 20th century. Matthew Joseph Ianniello entered the world on January 18, 1920, in Manhattan, in a neighborhood where traces of the old country clung stubbornly to the new. His parents were Italian immigrants, part of a wave that had crossed the Atlantic in the early years of the century, leaving rural poverty behind only to find a different kind of hardship in the United States. The streets around them were dense with brick tenements, shared toilets, narrow staircases, and families packed into small rooms. On summer nights, windows stayed open to let in any stray breeze, and voices in Neapolitan, Sicilian, and other regional dialects spilled down to the sidewalks. In those years, New York's Italian enclaves were still treated by many outsiders as foreign islands within the city, places spoken of with suspicion in newspapers and political speeches. The world into which Matthew was born was marked by contradiction. On one hand, there was opportunity: factories, construction sites, docks, and storefronts that needed cheap labor, promising at least the possibility of a better life than the one his parents had known in Italy. On the other hand, there was discrimination. Italian workers were often relegated to the lowest paid, most physically punishing jobs. Their churches, mutual aid societies, and social clubs acted as defenses against a society that did not easily accept them. Police attention in these neighborhoods could be inconsistent, harsh when it came to street kids and petty crime, more hesitant when it brushed up against older, better-connected figures who already formed the early backbone of organized crime in the city. When Matthew was still a child, the United States experimented with a nationwide ban on alcohol. Prohibition, beginning in 1920, transformed the streets around him. Officially, bars and saloons were supposed to close their doors or offer only soft drinks. In practice, the thirst for liquor did not disappear. In basements and back rooms, speakeasies operated behind unmarked doors, and men who had once been small-time neighborhood toughs suddenly found themselves linked to larger citywide networks bringing in illegal liquor. For a boy growing up in that environment, the line between legitimate and illegitimate business was not always obvious. A corner store might double as a meeting point for numbers runners. A cafe owner might pay quietly for protection to ensure his windows stayed intact. These realities were not unique to Matthew's block, but they formed the unspoken framework of everyday life. The 1920s brought prosperity to some parts of the country, but that prosperity was unevenly distributed, and it rarely reached the lower rungs of the immigrant neighborhoods. The first formative shock of Matthew's life came at the end of that decade. In 1929, when he was 9 years old, the American stock market crashed, and the effects rippled outward. In the early 1930s, the Great Depression turned precarious lives into desperate ones. Construction sites went quiet. Factory shifts were cut back or eliminated. Breadlines appeared, and unemployment became a stubborn fact of life. In districts like the one where the Ianniello family lived, the struggle to make rent and pay for food became more intense. In such times, the fragmented safety net that existed in Italian-American communities took on new importance. Local parishes organized soup kitchens. Charitable societies provided small loans or emergency assistance. But another, less official structure also filled the gaps: the world of neighborhood men of respect who operated outside the law. For some residents, borrowing money from a local lender who did not ask for paperwork but demanded strict repayment was the only option. For others, taking a job connected to a gambling racket or an unlicensed business was the difference between going hungry and getting by. Historians of organized crime emphasize that this period cemented the reputation of certain figures as alternative sources of stability and earnings, even as their activities undermined the rule of law and often exploited the very communities they claimed to serve. We know relatively little about Matthew's earliest years in terms of specific incidents or personal reflections. He did not leave memoirs, and most of what is recorded in official documents relates to his adult life. But public records and later investigative files agree on some key points. Like many children of working-class immigrant families, his formal education was limited. He attended local schools in Manhattan, but left after roughly the 8th grade. At a time when teenagers were expected to help keep their families afloat, continuing on to high school was a luxury many could not afford. By his mid-teens, he was working. Accounts of his early employment are consistent with the options available to boys from his background. He took on manual jobs as a laborer, as a helper on delivery trucks, and in other low-paid positions that required physical stamina more than formal skills. The streets of Manhattan, and later the outer boroughs, were lined with produce markets, wholesale warehouses, and small businesses that needed young men willing to carry heavy loads, make deliveries, and do whatever tasks were required. This was the environment in which Matthew's physicality began to stand out. Colleagues and neighbors would later describe him as stocky and powerful, someone who could work long hours without complaint. The nickname that would follow him into infamy, Matty the Horse, is generally understood to have originated in this period. A rough tribute to his ability to shoulder burdens and keep going when others tired. During the 1930s, the Italian-American underworld itself was undergoing a dramatic transformation. The bloody internal conflict known as the Castellammer's War, which had pitted rival Italian gangs against each other in New York, came to an end in the early part of the decade. Out of that conflict emerged a more modern, structured form of organized crime. Figures like Charles Lucky, Luciano, and Vito Genovese helped reshape the old country feuds into a business-oriented, hierarchical system, with clearly defined families and territories. By the time Matthew reached late adolescence, this system was taking root. Its leaders operated at a distance from everyday petty crime, but their influence filtered down through layers of associates, crew leaders, and intermediaries embedded in the same neighborhoods where he lived and worked. For a young man like Matthew, the presence of these networks was simply part of the social fabric. The same restaurant where a family celebrated a baptism might, late at night, become a discreet place where bookmakers settled accounts. The same trucking company that delivered produce might also be used to move contraband or to exert quiet control over which businesses received timely service and which did not. The boundary between a connected job and a purely legitimate one could be thin. There is no reliable evidence that Matthew played any major role in organized crime during his teenage years. That would come later. But the world he moved in familiarized him with the idea that influence, intimidation, and favors could matter as much as any official title. As the 1930s drew to a close, International events began to intrude on even the most insular city blocks. Newsreel footage at local cinemas showed the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe, including in Italy, and the outbreak of war overseas. For Italian Americans, the situation was complicated. Many still had relatives in Italy. Some felt pride in their heritage. Others had distanced themselves from the politics of the old country. Whatever their personal views, however, the United States' entry into the Second World War in 1941 changed everything. Young men of Matthew's age suddenly faced conscription or voluntary enlistment. The same government that had once treated their communities with suspicion now demanded their service, and many Italian Americans responded in large numbers, seeing military service as both obligation and opportunity. Matthew was 21 when the United States entered the war. Soon afterward, he joined the U.S. Army. Exact details of his enlistment process are not preserved in public biographical sources, but there is clear documentation about his service. He was assigned to the Pacific Theater, where he saw combat. The Pacific Campaign was marked by harsh conditions, dense jungles, tropical diseases, and intense, often close quarters fighting on remote islands. Many units rotated through repeated campaigns with limited rest. In that environment, the characteristics that had earned Matthew his nickname at home, resilience, stamina, the ability to endure physical hardship, were put to a very different test. During his service, Matthew was seriously wounded. Contemporary reports and later court summaries note that he lost an eye in combat and that he received the Purple Heart, the U.S. military decoration awarded to those wounded or killed while serving. He was also awarded the Bronze Star, which recognized acts of heroism or meritorious service in a combat zone. The exact incident that led to his injuries is not described in detail in openly available records, and we need not speculate on what cannot be verified. What is important for understanding his life is that he emerged from the war not only as a combat veteran, but as someone whose body permanently reflected the cost of that conflict. The transformation from urban laborer to decorated soldier was not unique to Matthew. It was a path shared by many men of his generation, but it carried particular weight in his case. Military service brought him into contact with people from across the United States, exposed him to strictly hierarchical organizations with clear chains of command, and tested his capacity to operate under pressure. At the same time, the experience of injury and survival likely reinforced a hard-edged understanding of risk. Historians who study the intersection of war and post-war crime have noted that some veterans, returning to neighborhoods with limited economic opportunity, were more willing than before to engage in high-stakes ventures, including illegal ones, especially when such ventures promised financial security and respect. When the war ended and Matthew returned to New York, he came back to a city in transition. The late 1940s were years of both optimism and dislocation. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, and the economy, fueled by pent-up consumer demand, began to grow. The GI Bill opened doors for many veterans, offering educational benefits and assistance in buying homes. Yet these opportunities did not fall evenly across all groups, and they were less accessible to men whose schooling had ended in the 8th grade. In working-class ethnic neighborhoods, the post-war period looked less like a sudden leap into the middle class and more like a slow negotiation between old routines and new pressures. For Matthew, the most immediate question was work. His wartime injuries limited certain forms of manual labor, but his background and contacts pointed him toward a familiar sector: food and drink. Restaurants, bars, and nightclubs were expanding to cater to returning soldiers, office workers, and tourists. In this environment, he moved into the hospitality business, first as a worker and eventually as an owner. By the early 1950s, he would come to be associated with a restaurant in Queens known as Matty's Towncrest, a place that combined his identity as a businessman with a subtler, emerging role as a facilitator of meetings and deals. That period marked the beginning of his transition from a hardworking veteran with modest formal education into a figure of interest to law enforcement agencies. But those developments lay just ahead. In the years immediately following the war, what defined Matthew's life were the same forces that shaped countless other returning soldiers. The effort to translate military discipline and reputation into civilian stability, the pull of family obligations, and the realities of a city where the legal and illegal economies were closely intertwined. When later indictments described him as a key player in the Genovese crime family, prosecutors would emphasize the continuity between his early work in restaurants and his later role in using such establishments as fronts and meeting points. To understand how that continuity formed, we have to see him first not as the fully realized Matty the Horse of tabloid headlines, but as a product of his time, a child of immigrant hardship, a teenager of the Depression, and a wounded veteran stepping back into a New York that was booming on the surface and deeply shadowed just beneath. Matty's towncrest stood on a Queen Street that, in the years after the war, was slowly filling with new houses, corner bars, and small stores. The neighborhood was neither the dense immigrant enclave of Lower Manhattan, nor the gleaming midtown of postcards. It was the in-between landscape of post-war New York, where returning soldiers and their families tried to turn modest savings and GI benefits into something more permanent. For Matthew Ianniello, the restaurant that bore his name was both livelihood and symbol. It drew on skills he had actually acquired before and after the war, long hours on his feet, an understanding of how to keep customers coming back, and a willingness to take on the quiet, unglamorous tasks of running a dining room. But over time, it also became something else, a point of contact between legal enterprise and a world of influence that did not operate through contracts or courts. Matthew's move into the restaurant business fit a broader pattern among Italian-American veterans. Many had grown up in families where relatives ran small groceries, cafes, or taverns. Food service felt familiar and, at least on the surface, respectable. Veterans' loans, informal loans from relatives, and pooled savings often provided the capital to lease or buy a modest establishment. In that sense, Matty's towncrest was not unusual. It offered meals, a bar, and a place where locals could gather. What made it stand out over time was not the menu, but the clientele and the connections that began to crystallize around it. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the American Mafia, the network of organized crime families with roots in Italian and Sicilian communities, had entered a more discreet but more entrenched phase. After the turmoil of the 1930s, the families had settled into relatively stable territories and specialties. The group that later came to be known as the Genovese crime family, with which Matthew would be most closely associated, focused heavily on construction, shipping, labor unions, and, increasingly, commercial sectors like the garment industry and nightlife. The family's power rested not only on overt crimes like extortion or illegal gambling, but on a subtler capacity to insert itself into legitimate businesses, quietly skimming profits or steering contracts. Restaurants and bars were especially attractive in this system. They dealt heavily in cash, making income hard for outsiders to track. They provided neutral spaces where men of different backgrounds could sit together without attracting much notice. And they served as informal employment agencies, places where a friend of a friend might be given a job, a loan, or access to someone who could sort out a problem. It was in this landscape that Matty's towncrest acquired a dual identity, a neighborhood place on one level, and on another, a useful outpost for figures who moved in the orbit of the Genovese family. Law enforcement documents that surfaced decades later show that, by the early 1950s, city and federal investigators had begun to take notice of the restaurant's owner. The references were initially sparse and cautious. They described Matthew as a man with no serious criminal record, a war veteran with a visible combat injury, and a reputation for reliability. but also as someone increasingly seen in the company of individuals already identified as associates or members of the Genovese organization. This was how many mid-level crime figures first entered official files, not through spectacular acts, but through repeated proximity to known players. In these years, Matthew's public persona remained that of a businessman. He was not known for ostentatious displays of wealth. Accounts from investigators and later courtroom testimony describe him as methodical rather than flamboyant, more likely to be found in a back office or at a reserved table than in the spotlight. Yet it was precisely this sober image, combined with his restaurant base, that made him valuable. Owners who felt pressured by unions, suppliers, or competitors sometimes sought out men reputed to have good connections, and Matthew was increasingly perceived as one. His experiences in the army, where rank and chain of command structured daily life, had familiarized him with hierarchical systems. Now, in a different context, he was learning how influence flowed through the unofficial hierarchy of a crime family. At the top of that hierarchy, the Genovese family was led, through the late 1940s and early 1950s, by Frank Costello, a boss who favored quiet manipulation over open confrontation. Under him were underbosses, advisors, and a network of caporgimes, or captains, each responsible for their own crews. These crews managed everything from gambling operations to labor rackets. While the names of the highest-ranking figures appeared in the newspapers and occasionally in televised hearings, the soldiers and trusted associates below them operated largely out of public view. It was into this lower tier, according to both law enforcement assessments and later historical studies, that Matthew gradually moved. The exact timing and circumstances of his formal induction into the Genovese family are not documented in public records. Organized crime groups rarely kept written membership rolls, and what is known about initiation ceremonies and promotion usually comes from informants or undercover investigations many years after the fact. What can be said with confidence is that by the late 1950s, federal agencies routinely listed him as a soldier in the Genovese family, and by the 1960s, he was regarded as a key figure in the group's control of bars, restaurants, and related businesses in parts of Queens and Manhattan. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged from a series of relationships cultivated patiently in back rooms and private meetings, where his wartime toughness, reputation for discretion, and ability to run a business combined to make him a useful asset. The broader social climate of the 1950s both helped and hindered men like Matthew. On one side, anti-communist fervor and Cold War anxieties dominated national politics, drawing some attention away from organized crime. On the other side, a new wave of investigative journalists, crusading politicians, and law enforcement officials saw organized crime as a domestic threat that needed to be exposed. The televised Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950-51, which explored nationwide gambling and mob activities, brought the word mafia into living rooms across America. Senators interrogated casino operators, bookies, and suspected mobsters under hot television lights. Some denied everything. Others invoked their constitutional rights and refused to answer. Matthew's name did not appear in those famous hearings, but he could not have been unaware of them. Italian-American communities followed the proceedings with mixed feelings, anger at the reinforcement of damaging stereotypes, but also fascination with the spectacle of usually invisible figures being called publicly to account. For the Genovese family, the hearings were a warning shot. High-profile bosses attracted attention. Lower-profile managers became more valuable. Men who looked like ordinary business owners, who could move comfortably between legitimate and illegitimate circles without drawing headlines, were an asset. Matthew was positioned to become exactly that kind of figure. Within the restaurant and bar industry, labor relations formed a crucial battleground. The hotel and restaurant employees' unions, along with bartenders, locals, and related organizations aimed to secure better wages and conditions. Their leaders negotiated contracts, controlled job referrals, and oversaw pension and health funds. For organized crime, these unions offered a triple opportunity: to extort employers by threatening strikes or disruptions, to siphon money from benefit funds through corrupt schemes, and to place loyal associates in key positions. Over time, numerous investigations would reveal the depth of mob infiltration in these organizations, particularly in New York. Matthew's expertise in hospitality, combined with his connections, meant that he was well placed to serve as a bridge between employers and union officials. Some employers, wary of direct contact with union leadership or anxious to avoid prolonged disputes, preferred to deal with an intermediary who had the ear of both sides. Law enforcement reports later described Matthew as a labor consultant of sorts, someone who could help smooth out conflicts, often by pressuring one side or the other. In practical terms, this could mean persuading a union delegate not to press a grievance, or convincing a reluctant bar owner to sign a contract or make under-the-table payments in exchange for labor peace. From a narrow, short-term perspective, these solutions sometimes appeared to work. Businesses avoided disruptive strikes, workers kept or gained jobs, the visible machinery of daily commerce continued to function, but the underlying cost was high. Legitimate union democracy was undermined, with decisions made behind closed doors rather than in open meetings. Employers who resisted were threatened with boycotts, slowdowns, or inspections. Funds intended for workers' pensions and health benefits were vulnerable to misuse. In this environment, Matthew's role grew. He became known not simply as a restaurateur, but as a man whose support could make or break a venture in the hospitality field. The geography of his influence also expanded, while Queens remained important. The gravitational pull of Manhattan, especially Midtown and the areas around Times Square, became stronger. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Times Square was in transition. The glamorous theaters and grand hotels remained, but so did a quieter undercurrent of less reputable attractions: small gambling operations, unlicensed bars, and, increasingly, businesses catering to adult entertainment. At a time when city regulations were strict and social stigma strong, these enterprises often operated in a gray zone, vulnerable to closure at the hands of the police, but also able to thrive if they could secure the right protection. Another crucial part of this environment was the treatment of gay and lesbian New Yorkers. In the mid-20th century, bars that served gay patrons risked losing their licenses or being raided. As a result, many such establishments operated semi-illegally or under licenses obtained through front owners. Official protection from the state was weak at best. Harassment and raids were common. In that vacuum, organized crime figures saw a profitable niche. They could open or take over bars catering to gay clientele, pay off police to limit interference, and charge high prices while cutting corners on safety and hygiene. Patrons, facing few alternatives, often tolerated poor conditions because the ability to gather openly, however precariously, mattered more than the state of the glassware or the honesty of the tab. Over time, multiple investigative reports and historical studies would identify the Genovese family as a dominant force in this sector in New York City, particularly in Manhattan. Within that structure, Matthew emerged as the figure overseeing many of these bar and club interests. Names of individual establishments varied and changed, licenses shifted hands, and front owners came and went, but the pattern remained. Behind a series of seemingly independent bars and night spots stood a consistent set of controllers. By the early 1960s, law enforcement and regulatory agencies were increasingly convinced that Matthew was one of the central managers coordinating these holdings for the Genovese organization. It is important to emphasize that this control did not translate into protection in any meaningful moral sense. The arrangement primarily served those at the top of the financial ladder. Bar owners, often operating under pressure, shared profits, or paid fixed sums. Staff were hired and fired at the discretion of managers who answered not to customers or employees, but to higher-ups concerned mainly with the bottom line. Patrons, meanwhile, remained vulnerable to police action. When raids occurred, it was typically the customers and workers who bore the immediate cost, not the unseen partners in the background. Later accounts of the era, particularly in the context of the gay rights movement, would highlight this dynamic. The same figures who profited from marginalized communities were sometimes willing to abandon them quickly if circumstances changed. As Matthew's responsibilities grew, so too did law enforcement interest. The 1960s saw the federal government invest more heavily in organized crime investigations. The notorious meeting of mafia leaders in Appalachian, New York, in 1957, which was broken up by state police, had provided dramatic proof of a national network. In response, agencies like the FBI and the Justice Department developed new strategies, including more systematic surveillance and the use of informants. Municipal and state authorities in New York City also began keeping more detailed files on suspected organized crime figures. Matthew's name began to surface more frequently in these documents. Surveillance logs noted his presence at gatherings of known Genovese members. Confidential informants described him as a collector and controller for certain rackets, particularly in Queens and Manhattan nightlife. He was linked by investigators to illegal gambling operations, including card games and numbers betting, often connected to the bars and clubs with which he was associated. While he avoided the kind of high-profile arrests that brought down some of his contemporaries in this period, his profile in organized crime intelligence steadily rose. At the same time, his reputation within the underworld appears to have solidified. Accounts from turncoat witnesses years later would describe him as a man who combined a calm, almost reserved demeanor with a willingness to enforce orders. The nickname, Matty the Horse, originally a reference to physical endurance, took on a second meaning: someone who could be relied upon to carry a heavy load of responsibility within the organization. He was not the official boss of the Genovese family, but he had become, by the mid-1960s, one of its important mid-level leaders, managing a broad portfolio of businesses and rackets. For the neighborhoods in which he operated, the effects were complex. On some blocks, his presence, or the presence of his associates, was seen as a stabilizing force. Disputes between bar owners or between owners and suppliers were handled in ways that avoided public blow-ups. Street-level crime around certain establishments was kept low, not out of civic duty, but because order was good for business. On the other hand, this apparent stability masked deeper costs: the distortion of market competition, the exploitation of workers and patrons, and the entrenchment of a system in which serious decisions were taken by people who never appeared on any official list of stakeholders. By the end of the 1960s, Matthew was no longer simply the former soldier who had returned to run a neighborhood restaurant. He was a recognized figure within one of the most powerful crime families in the United States, with influence that extended from Queens dining rooms to the neon-lit streets of Times Square, and the shadowed doorways of bars that served communities pushed to the margins of legal protection. Law enforcement files, while incomplete, traced a clear arc, from small-scale businessman with worrying associations to a central organizer of major illegal revenue streams. Yet he remained, publicly, a paradox. To some, he was still the decorated veteran and successful proprietor. To federal agents and prosecutors, he was increasingly a priority target. The tension between these two images, the respectable outer shell and the hidden network of intimidation and control, would only sharpen in the years to come, as social movements challenged the old order in the streets and courtrooms began slowly to catch up with the realities of organized crime in America's largest city. The closing years of the 1960s tested the uneasy arrangements that had allowed Matthew Ianniello and his associates to profit quietly from the shadows of New York nightlife. The world around them was changing. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the first stirrings of gay liberation all challenged institutions that had long gone unexamined. On the surface, the bars and clubs tied to the Genovese family still seemed to operate as they always had. Cash businesses, limited bookkeeping, a rotation of managers and nominal owners who came and went. But beneath that surface, the social bargain on which those ventures depended, a bargain that assumed silence from the people they exploited and discretion from the police, was beginning to fray. One place where those tensions erupted was a narrow, dimly lit bar in Greenwich Village, the Stonewall Inn. By the late 1960s, Stonewall was one of a cluster of establishments catering primarily to gay men, at a time when such venues existed in a fragile space between toleration and criminalization. Officially, New York State's liquor authorities still treated serving gay patrons as grounds for revocation of a license. Police raids were common, sometimes couched in terms of enforcing alcohol laws, sometimes framed as crackdowns on disorderly premises. In this inhospitable environment, legitimate investors were scarce. Into that vacuum stepped the Genovese family, which had already discovered that bars serving marginalized communities could be lucrative so long as they were carefully managed. Payments to local precincts were maintained, and no one at the top attracted attention. Historians of the period, drawing on law enforcement files and contemporary reporting, broadly agree that Stonewall was part of this network. It operated under the names of front owners, but the real financial control lay higher. Matthew, by then a seasoned Genovese captain with extensive interests in bars and clubs, is widely identified as one of the key figures overseeing gay bars in Manhattan, including Stonewall and similar establishments. He was not the man checking IDs at the door or tending bar. His role was to arrange leases, secure supplies, handle disputes, and ensure that the required envelopes reached the right desks in the local precinct and at regulatory offices. The system was designed to keep direct exposure away from him and from the family's leadership. The way these establishments operated reflected the imbalance of power that lay at their core. Because they lacked official protection, managers cut corners. Health and safety standards were loose. Fire exits might be blocked, bathrooms poorly maintained, drinks served without proper licensing or oversight. Customers were charged high prices for watered-down liquor. In some cases, bar staff or door personnel kept informal lists of patrons, names and workplaces, information that could be used to pressure individuals fearful of being publicly identified in a hostile society. For Matthew and the organization, these practices translated into strong profit margins. For patrons, they meant entering spaces where they were both welcomed as paying customers and kept vulnerable by design. On the night of June 27-28, 1969, that precarious equilibrium snapped. A routine police raid on the Stonewall Inn, intended to check licenses and make arrests under alcohol and morality laws, met with unexpected resistance. Officers attempted to move patrons outside in small groups as they had many times before. But this time, instead of dispersing meekly into the night, people gathered, shouted, and eventually fought back. The confrontation spilled into the street and continued over several nights. The Stonewall Uprising, as it came to be known, did not emerge from nowhere. It was the product of years of pent-up anger at police harassment, social exclusion, and economic exploitation. For Matthew and those in his circle, the events at Stonewall posed a different kind of problem. The bar they controlled had suddenly become the focal point of a national conversation about civil rights and policing. Reporters descended on the neighborhood. Gay and lesbian activists, many of whom had long resented the way mob-linked bars treated them, now saw an opportunity to demand change. They were no longer willing to accept a deal in which organized crime figures took the profits while customers bore the risk. The uprising did not immediately end the Genovese family's role in gay bars. That would take years, but it marked the beginning of a shift. As the gay rights movement grew more assertive and some legal barriers began to fall, the leverage that figures like Matthew had enjoyed over that market slowly eroded. In the short term, however, his position in the underworld remained secure. The Genovese family had no intention of abandoning profitable sectors because of one bar's notoriety. If anything, the late 1960s and early 1970s saw Matthew broaden the range of his interests. Times Square, a short subway ride from Greenwich Village, was undergoing its own transformation. Once dominated by legitimate theaters and large movie palaces, the area was increasingly filled with smaller grindhouse cinemas, adult bookstores, strip clubs, and peep-show arcades. Lax zoning, high foot traffic, and landlords seeking reliable rent payments created an environment in which cash-heavy entertainment businesses thrived. Again, legitimate banks and investors were cautious. Organized crime stepped in. Through shell corporations and nominees, Matthew and his crew took stakes in or exercised influence over numerous Times Square establishments. Some were outright adult entertainment venues. Others were more conventional bars and restaurants that benefited from the steady flow of visitors to the district. His control was seldom obvious to a casual passerby. Licenses bore the names of front owners who appeared at state liquor hearings and, if necessary, signed affidavits claiming sole responsibility. Behind those names, financial records, when they existed at all, told a different story, one of regular payments flowing up the chain. Law enforcement agencies, by now devoting more attention to organized crime, began to piece together that story. New York State Liquor Authority, SLA, embarrassed by repeated scandals involving paper owners concealing mob interests, tightened some of its procedures. Background checks became more thorough, and investigators learned to look for patterns. The same lawyers filing applications for different premises, similar corporate structures appearing in multiple cases, or suspiciously consistent suppliers. In internal memoranda and slow-circulating intelligence reports, SLA staff and police officers increasingly linked clusters of licenses in Queens and Manhattan to Matthew Wright's network. The NYPD itself was not immune from scrutiny. The early 1970s Knapp Commission, established to investigate police corruption, exposed widespread practices of officers taking money from bar and club owners in exchange for leniency or advanced warning of inspections. Some of these owners were directly or indirectly tied to Matthew. Testimony revealed regular pad systems in which beat cops, sergeants, and sometimes higher-ranking officers received payments from vice-related businesses. While the commission focused primarily on systemic corruption rather than specific mob figures, its findings confirmed what people in neighborhoods like Times Square had long known, that the protection enabling illicit enterprises did not come solely from intimidation, but also from financial arrangements that compromised law enforcement. For Matthew, this combination of influence over unions, over bars and restaurants, and through them over segments of the police, translated into considerable power. He was, by most accounts, a loyal Genovese family member who understood that his authority derived from the organization. Yet within his own sphere, he made decisions that affected hundreds of workers and business owners. Which club would receive a green light to open, who would be allowed to operate on a particular block, which union official could keep his position, which could not. To those who cooperated, he could appear almost businesslike, an efficient if intimidating mediator. To those who resisted, he represented an implacable force backed by the threat of economic ruin or worse. The first serious cracks in his legal armor emerged in the early 1970s, and they did not come, at least at first, from large federal racketeering cases. Instead, they grew out of something more mundane, restaurant ownership and taxes. In April 1972, a dramatic event far from Queens suddenly put one of his Little Italy interests in the spotlight. In the small hours of the morning, during a birthday celebration at Umberto S. Clam House on Mulberry Street, mob figure Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo was shot and killed. The killing, which made front-page news, was part of a violent feud within the Colombo crime family and did not involve Matthew directly. But the publicity surrounding the shooting brought intense scrutiny to Umberto S., including its licensing and ownership. Investigators from the State Liquor Authority and other agencies, already wary of mob infiltration of restaurants, began parsing the paper trail behind Umberto S. They discovered that, on paper, the establishment's official owners were individuals with modest means and little prior experience in the restaurant business. As regulators dug deeper, financial records, informant statements, and related evidence suggested that the real capital and control behind Umberto S. came from elsewhere. Matthew S. name surfaced repeatedly. He was linked not only to Umberto S., but to a small network of similar eateries and bars whose paperwork showed the same irregularities. Loans not recorded in formal contracts, cash-based transactions that bypassed conventional accounting, and licensed owners who appeared to have been compensated simply for putting their names on documents. On its own, concealed ownership of a restaurant was not the kind of charge that would topple a major crime figure, but for prosecutors and tax authorities, it offered a starting point. If a man claimed a modest income on his tax returns, while evidently enjoying the lifestyle of someone with multiple thriving businesses, something was amiss. In Matthew's case, this mismatch between reported income and apparent wealth, combined with the evidence of hidden stakes in liquor license premises, prompted federal and state investigations targeting possible tax evasion, false statements to regulatory bodies, and conspiracy to defraud the government. Over the next few years, these investigations resulted in his first serious criminal charges. Indictments accused him of concealing his interest in certain restaurants and bars, of providing false information to the State Liquor Authority, and of underreporting income tied to these enterprises on his federal tax returns. The cases were complex, involving stacks of financial records, testimony from former employees and nominal owners, and expert analyses tracing cash flows through a web of shell companies and informal arrangements. Prosecutors argued that this was not a matter of sloppy bookkeeping, but of deliberate concealment designed to keep regulators and tax collectors from seeing the full extent of his business empire. Matthew's defense leaned heavily on his public persona as a legitimate businessman. He acknowledged involvement in some ventures, but downplayed his role in others, insisting that he had merely lent money or offered advice, and that he could not be held responsible for every irregularity in the paperwork of establishments with which he was casually associated. He stressed his military service, his injury in the Pacific, and his post-war record of employment. Defense attorneys portrayed the government's case as an overreach, an attempt to transform common practices in cash-based industries into evidence of criminal conspiracy simply because of their client's reputation. Juries, however, were not entirely persuaded. In the mid-1970s, Matthew was convicted in federal court on charges that included tax violations linked to his concealed restaurant interests. He received a prison sentence and a fine, marking the first time he would serve significant time behind bars as an adult. The term was not extremely long by the standards of organized crime prosecutions. Later racketeering cases would carry much heavier penalties, but it was a clear signal that the era of near-total impunity was ending. Government agencies had learned that following the money, rather than waiting for dramatic acts of violence, could yield concrete results. His incarceration had a dual effect. On a personal level, it was a humbling experience for a man used to giving orders rather than taking them. On an organizational level, It demonstrated the resilience of the system that sustained him. The Genovese family had protocols for such contingencies. While he was in custody, others managed day-to-day operations of his rackets, and funds were set aside to support his family and cover legal fees. This was part of the implicit contract within the mafia: loyalty and silence in exchange for continued backing even when law enforcement struck. When he was released, he returned not as a marginalized figure, but as someone whose willingness to endure prison without cooperating with authorities had, if anything, enhanced his standing. The landscape he re-entered, however, was not the same one he had left. The late 1970s brought both new opportunities and new dangers for organized crime figures. On one side, the economic malaise of the decade, with its rising unemployment and city fiscal crises, created fresh vulnerabilities in sectors like waste management, construction, and transportation, areas that the Genovese family and other organizations were eager to exploit. On the other side, federal prosecutors were increasingly turning to the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, a powerful legal tool enacted in 1970 that allowed them to target patterns of criminal activity within an enterprise rather than isolated acts. Even before RICO-based indictments reached him personally, Matthew could sense the tightening net. Surveillance became more pervasive. Phones were tapped, restaurants bugged, and long lenses trained on sidewalk meetings. Veterans of the Underworld adjusted their behavior in response. Meetings were moved to supposedly secure locations, sometimes outdoors, sometimes in back rooms where music or the clatter of dishes might mask casual conversation. Code words and cryptic references appeared more often in conversations, yet complete secrecy was impossible. The very structure that made Matthew valuable, his broad range of contacts across unions, businesses, and other organized crime figures, also made him visible in law enforcement charts mapping relationships and influence. It was during this period, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, that his role within the Genovese family reached a new level of prominence. Long-standing bosses faced illness, imprisonment, or death, and the organization turned to experienced, reliable figures to maintain operations. Matthew, with his established networks in nightlife, unions, and emerging interests in sectors like waste hauling and construction-related services, was well placed to take on greater responsibility. To observers within law enforcement, his name began appearing not just in the margins of reports, but closer to the center, described as part of the group that effectively ran day-to-day affairs for the family. For the communities affected by his activities, these years were marked by continuity rather than dramatic change. Bars, restaurants, and adult entertainment venues continued to open and close under different names, but similar patterns of control. Certain unions remained opaque to their rank and file members, with key decisions appearing to come from unseen hands. Business owners in waste management and related fields encountered the familiar combination of offers they could not easily refuse: guaranteed routes or contracts in exchange for surrendering some control and a share of profits, or the promise of trouble if they attempted to operate entirely independently. The distinction, increasingly, lay not in how these arrangements functioned on the street, but in how they were understood in court. Prosecutors were moving away from chasing individual episodes, one extortion payment, one instance of bribery, and toward painting a comprehensive picture of how men like Matthew integrated legal and illegal businesses into a cohesive system of control. In internal strategy sessions, assistant U.S. attorneys and FBI agents discussed him not just as a restaurateur or union fixer, but as a crucial node in the Genovese family's broader enterprise. The next wave of investigations would reflect this shift in perspective, and when it arrived, it would push Matthew from the half-light of regulatory hearings and tax cases into the glaring illumination of major federal racketeering trials. By the late 1970s, The New York that had shaped Matthew Ianniello's rise was creaking under the strain of economic crisis and political distrust. The city had narrowly escaped bankruptcy in 1975. Public services had been cut, and entire neighborhoods bore the marks of disinvestment. In that landscape, the ability to guarantee work, to deliver contracts, or simply to keep a business open in a difficult climate was worth more than ever. For the Genovese crime family, these conditions were not just background noise. They were an opening. And for Matthew, recently tested by his first serious prison term for tax offenses tied to concealed restaurant interests, they offered a chance both to prove his continued usefulness and to climb higher within the organization. His earlier conviction had not stripped him of his role. Inside prison, he had done what mafia rules expected. He kept silent, accepted his sentence, and did not cooperate with authorities. Outside, associates maintained his interests as best they could. When he returned to the street, he did so as a man whose loyalty had been demonstrated under pressure. Law enforcement reports and later court filings agree that he resumed a central role in managing the Genovese family's food and drink empire. Bars, nightclubs, restaurants, and adult entertainment venues spread across Queens, Manhattan, and beyond. But this time, his reach did not stop there. Investigators began to see his fingerprints on industries that lay closer to the heart of the city's struggling infrastructure. Waste hauling was one of those industries. For decades, private carting companies had collected commercial trash from restaurants, stores, and office buildings in New York. On paper, this was a competitive business. In practice, organized crime families, including the Genovese, often carved up territories and routes behind the scenes, maintaining property rights in customers through threats and mutually enforced agreements. Companies that tried to undercut established firms or switch carting providers without permission risked vandalism, harassment, or loss of access to key routes. In this system, unions representing drivers and loaders were a crucial tool. Control over a union local could mean control over who worked, which companies prospered, and which were driven out. By the end of the 1970s, federal and state investigators repeatedly identified Matthew as one of the senior Genovese figures involved in this wider pattern of labor racketeering. His earlier experience with restaurant and hotel unions translated readily into this new context. The methods were similar: quietly installed union officers, sweetheart contracts that favored certain employers, pension and welfare funds vulnerable to misuse, and an unwritten understanding that major decisions required consultation with people who never appeared on any official ballot. Waste management, construction-related trucking, and certain building trades unions all became part of the web of influence in which he operated. At the same time, his long-standing base in nightlife continued to flourish and, in some respects, to evolve. Times Square and the surrounding blocks had moved further from their mid-century image as a glamorous crossroads. The area was now notorious for its concentration of adult businesses, peep show arcades, massage parlors, and small, dimly lit bars. Some of these places were little more than narrow storefronts with a few booths or a tiny stage. Others were more elaborate clubs with neon signs and loud music. For police and city officials, the district was a headache and an embarrassment. For Matthew and the Genovese leadership, it was still a rich source of cash. This combination of sectors, nightlife, unions, and essential city services like carting, made Matthew particularly important to the family during a period of transition at the top. The Genovese organization prided itself on stability and secrecy. Its true bosses often operated from the shadows, allowing front bosses to absorb public attention and, if necessary, legal blows. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, longtime power brokers were aging or dying. Frank Thierry, a key figure who had served as a front boss, was convicted in a racketeering case and died in 1981. Behind him, the reclusive Philip Lombardo, long suspected by law enforcement as the real head of the family, was reportedly in declining health. federal agents and prosecutors concluded that a new arrangement emerged. Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno acted as the visible boss, while other senior figures, including Matthew, provided the organizational muscle and oversight needed to keep revenue streams steady. Exactly how Genovese's leadership was apportioned in those years remains a topic of debate among historians and former law enforcement officials. The family did not issue organizational charts, and different informants offered different narratives. But internal FBI memoranda from the period, later cited in court, consistently described Matthew as more than just a capo. He was listed as a central manager for the family's operations in specific sectors, above all, nightlife and certain unions, and, at times, as an acting boss or coordinator when more public leaders faced health problems or criminal cases. The precise title mattered less than the reality that decisions passed through him, and that his say carried great weight. This rise in status also increased the attention he received from law enforcement. The 1970 Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, had given federal prosecutors a powerful new tool. Instead of charging isolated acts, one extortion payment, one bribery attempt, they could charge a pattern of such acts as part of a single offense, tied together by the existence of an enterprise. Through the 1970s, RICO was tested in a series of cases around the country. By the early 1980s, it had become clear that prosecutors were prepared to use it against the highest levels of organized crime in New York. In practice, building a RICO case required patient, cumulative work. Investigators needed to show that the defendant had participated in a pattern of racketeering acts, such as extortion, illegal gambling, mail or wire fraud, or bribery, connected to an ongoing enterprise. For Matthew, this meant that federal agents began tracking not just one bar or one union deal, but the overarching pattern, how money flowed from an array of businesses back to him, and through him, to the Genovese family. The FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, the IRS, and state authorities all contributed pieces to the puzzle. Surveillance intensified. Agents followed him to meetings in restaurants and social clubs. They recorded the license plates of the cars parked outside. Where possible, they obtained court orders to wiretap telephones linked to his associates or to place listening devices in offices and back rooms. Some of these efforts yielded only fragments of conversations, coded references to our friends or the people downtown. Others captured more explicit discussions of money, union officials, and the need to take care of certain individuals. Over time, those fragments were assembled into a broader picture that prosecutors believed could stand up in court. A critical focus for that picture was his network of bars and clubs. Investigators identified a cluster of establishments in Midtown Manhattan, Times Square, and other parts of the city, along with some in neighboring states, where the same patterns recurred. Official ownership shifted among a small pool of individuals with limited independent resources. Licensing applications bore the signatures of men and women who, when questioned, appeared unsure of basic financial details about their businesses. Suppliers and employees spoke of receiving instructions not from the nominal owners, but from other figures who visited frequently and handled major decisions. According to the government, those figures ultimately answered to Matthew. The alleged schemes took several forms. In some cases, prosecutors argued, he and his associates had simply concealed their financial stakes in order to avoid scrutiny by regulators, and to shield themselves from liability if problems arose. In others, they claimed, he had used intimidation and the threat of economic retaliation to force business owners to turn over part ownership or to pay regular sums for protection. In still others, they asserted that he had manipulated union contracts to ensure that certain bars and restaurants hired from particular labor pools or used designated suppliers, thereby funneling additional business to companies under mob influence. By the early 1980s, these strands converged in a series of grand jury investigations. Witnesses ranging from former bartenders to accountants were called to testify behind closed doors. Some were cooperative from the start, eager to distance themselves from their past associations or to avoid prosecution. Others spoke only after receiving immunity or facing the possibility of indictment themselves. Their statements, combined with documents seized under search warrants and months of surveillance logs, provided the backbone of a sweeping racketeering case. In 1985, federal prosecutors unveiled a detailed indictment charging Matthew and several co-defendants with RICO violations and related offenses. The charges alleged that, over many years, they had participated in an enterprise that controlled numerous bars, nightclubs, and adult entertainment businesses, particularly in the Times Square area and in parts of Queens and Connecticut. According to the indictment, the enterprise used threats, concealed interests, and union manipulation to generate illicit profits, which were then divided among the participants and ultimately kicked up to the higher echelons of the Genovese family. The indictment did not charge him with acts of spectacular violence. Instead, it painted a portrait of continuous, organized pressure. License applications falsified or fronted, rent figures manipulated, tax liabilities obscured, and employees and managers kept in line through a mix of favored treatment and implied menace. For prosecutors, this was a deliberate strategy. They wanted to show that the essence of organized crime lay not only in headline-grabbing crimes, but in the quiet exploitation of economic life, day after day, year after year. The trial that followed drew significant attention. It took place against the backdrop of the more famous Commission case, in which federal prosecutors charged a group of top mafia leaders, including Anthony Salerno, with collectively directing the affairs of New York's 5 major crime families. While Matthew was not among the defendants in that Commission trial, his RICO case was widely seen as part of the same overarching offensive against organized crime. Together, the cases signaled that the government intended to dismantle not just individual rackets, but the leadership structures that sustained them. Inside the courtroom, the government's case against him unfolded methodically. Jurors heard from bar owners who described being approached by intermediaries and told, in cautious but unmistakable terms, that their businesses would run more smoothly if they accepted certain partnerships or contracts. They listened to union officials, some testifying under grants of immunity, who acknowledged that key decisions about strikes or contract negotiations had been influenced by outside advice. They saw financial charts illustrating how money moved from cash registers through a chain of managers and corporations to accounts linked to Matthew and other defendants. Taped conversations, where available, provided particularly vivid evidence. Although participants avoided explicit phrasing, prosecutors argued that the overall context left little doubt about what was being discussed. References to straightening out, a problem with an unruly employee, to reminding a landlord of his obligations, or to ensuring that our people stayed in certain positions were presented as coded descriptions of coercion and control. Defense attorneys countered that much of this language could be interpreted innocently, that prosecutors were reading criminal intent into ordinary business disputes, and that the government's witnesses, many of whom had their own legal troubles, had strong incentives to shade the truth. Matthew's defense also leaned, once again, on his public image as a legitimate businessman and a war veteran. His attorneys emphasized that he held ownership stakes in some establishments openly, that cash-heavy businesses often had messy records without any criminal conspiracy, and that he had never been convicted of violent acts. They argued that the prosecution was attempting to turn him into a symbol of organized crime more than a proven orchestrator of any particular scheme. Throughout the trial, reporters noted his calm demeanor at the defense table, his damaged eye a silent reminder of his military past, in stark contrast to the government's portrayal of him as a central figure in a network of exploitation. When the jury returned its verdict, it largely sided with the prosecution. Matthew was convicted on multiple counts of racketeering and related offenses. The RICO convictions rested on the conclusion that he had participated in an enterprise that conducted its affairs through a pattern of illegal acts, including extortion and fraud, tied to the control of specific bars and restaurants. At sentencing, the judge imposed a substantial prison term, more than a decade, and ordered the forfeiture of significant sums of money and interests in various establishments. The precise numbers, reported at the time, reflected the court's view that these businesses had been thoroughly entwined with organized crime activities, and that removing his stake in them was necessary to break that link. The decision had implications beyond his personal fate. On appeal, his case generated an important ruling in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. The appellate judges upheld the convictions and, in doing so, clarified aspects of RICO law, particularly how courts should interpret the enterprise element and the required pattern of racketeering activity. Legal commentators noted that the decision in his case made it easier for prosecutors to sustain RICO convictions in future organized crime prosecutions, by confirming that an enterprise could be defined around a network of related businesses controlled in common, even if its structure was not formally elaborate. For law enforcement officials, the outcome was a major victory. They publicly hailed the sentence as a blow to the Genovese family's grip on Times Square and related sectors. Some of the bars and clubs previously linked to his network closed. Others changed hands under closer regulatory scrutiny. Union locals suspected of being under his influence faced renewed oversight, with some leaders removed or pressured into retirement. The message was clear. The old assumption that mid-level mafia figures could manipulate unions, public services, and entertainment zones indefinitely without facing comprehensive legal consequences no longer held. Yet the story did not end there. While he began serving his new sentence, federal and state authorities continued to pursue additional cases related to his activities in waste hauling and labor racketeering. Grand juries in New York and Connecticut examined evidence that he and other Genovese members had extorted payments from carting companies, manipulated bidding processes for commercial trash collection, and exerted improper influence over union locals whose members worked in those industries. In some of these matters, he faced new charges. In others, his earlier convictions served as background evidence of a long-standing pattern of conduct. From the perspective of the communities affected by these rackets, the cumulative impact was significant but uneven. Some business owners in Times Square and the outer boroughs reported greater freedom to operate without paying unauthorized fees, even as they contended with new challenges from rising rents and gentrification pressures. Union members sometimes saw internal reforms, but long-entrenched habits of deference and fear could not be swept away overnight. For Matthew, the man at the center of these cases, the late 1980s marked a decisive turning point. The moment when the combination of RICO, determined prosecutors, and shifting public expectations finally converted his decades-long pattern of behind-the-scenes power into an extended loss of liberty. Behind prison walls, his world narrowed. The bars, clubs, and union offices where he had once been a constant presence were now managed by others, some within the Genovese orbit, others entirely new entrants into those markets. The organization to which he had devoted his adult life adjusted accordingly, redistributing responsibilities and cultivating the next generation of managers and enforcers. For all its claims of invulnerability, the Genovese family could not escape the reality that the strategies used against Matthew, patient financial investigation, sophisticated use of RICO, and a willingness to treat economic crimes as seriously as overt violence, were changing the terrain on which organized crime operated in New York. The new legal landscape that had just sent Matthew Ianniello to a long federal sentence did not stop evolving once he passed through the prison gates. If anything, his conviction on racketeering charges related to bars, nightclubs, and labor dealings in Times Square and Queens emboldened prosecutors to widen their focus. They had proven that the law could reach a man who, for years, had occupied the gray zone between legitimate businessman and underworld organizer. Now they turned to other corners of the economy where his name had surfaced in surveillance reports and informant debriefings. Beginning with an industry New Yorkers depended on every day but rarely thought about: the trucks that carried away their garbage. For decades, commercial trash hauling in the New York metropolitan area had been shaped by a system that outsiders often misunderstood. Businesses did not simply pick the cheapest carting company from a list. In many neighborhoods, customer lists were treated as private property. A restaurant, a small factory, or a storefront might be owned as an account by a particular hauler, who in turn had an understanding with other firms and with people in the underworld that this relationship was not to be disturbed. New customers were divided up quietly. Prices stayed well above what a truly competitive market would have produced. Companies that tried to cut rates or sign up accounts outside the established pattern found their trucks sabotaged, their drivers harassed, or their new customers abruptly visited by men advising them to reconsider. Unions were woven into this fabric. Drivers and loaders who belonged to certain locals knew that their jobs depended not only on company goodwill, but also on the favor of figures whose power wasn't listed in any official bylaws. Pension funds, health plans, and overtime rules could be used as leverage to keep men loyal, to pressure employers, or to reward companies that cooperated with the unspoken cartel. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, state and federal investigators had mapped enough of these connections to conclude that the Genovese family had a major stake in the carting industry, particularly in parts of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and the lower Hudson Valley. Matthew's name appeared with growing frequency in those reports. Agents who had tracked him in the bar and restaurant world noted that some of the same union officials he dealt with also had ties to carting locals. A few small haulers, facing unrelated legal problems, quietly told investigators that they had been pressured to make payments to people they knew only by nicknames, but that, through street gossip and occasional sightings in social clubs, they understood those men to be connected to his crew. Gradually, prosecutors began to see his Times Square and Queens operations not as isolated rackets, but as part of a broader strategic approach. Use control of labor and cash-heavy businesses to exert influence over auxiliary services, from linen suppliers to trucking. In the second half of the 1980s, this picture crystallized into new indictments. Federal grand juries in Connecticut and in the Southern District of New York heard testimony from carting company owners, union officials, and former insiders who described a network in which companies were assigned territories and accounts. Bid prices were discussed informally in advance to keep them artificially high, and a portion of the inflated profits found their way back to organized crime figures. According to those indictments, Matthew, even while facing his existing convictions, had been a central participant in shaping and benefiting from this system. The charges against him in these new cases followed familiar legal lines: racketeering under RICO, extortion under the Hobbs Act, mail and wire fraud tied to falsified invoices, or sham competitive bidding. What differed was the industry at stake. Garbage hauling and related services might not have had the headline appeal of Times Square strip clubs, but they touched a far larger swath of the economy. Office towers, shopping centers, supermarkets, and small businesses all depended on predictable, legally compliant waste removal. Prosecutors argued that when mob-backed cartels fixed prices and carved up territories, it was not only rival haulers who suffered. Every business that paid an inflated bill and every consumer who ultimately bore those costs was affected. Facing this new wave of charges from inside prison, Matthew and his lawyers made a pragmatic calculation. Unlike his earlier case, where he had opted to go to trial and fight the government's narrative, the evidence in some of the carding matters was diffuse but persistent. There were tapes of conversations about roots and our people in certain companies, financial records showing regular unexplained payments, and testimony from industry insiders who had grown weary of squeezing modest profits out of a market they believed was rigged against them. After negotiations, he entered guilty pleas in several of these cases, acknowledging participation in racketeering schemes linked to the commercial waste hauling business and to union corruption in that field. The sentences that followed added substantial time to the years he was already serving. Judges imposed additional prison terms measured in years, much of them ordered to run concurrently with his existing racketeering sentence, but still extending the horizon of his incarceration. They also levied multi-million-dollar fines and ordered forfeitures of interests in businesses tied to the schemes. These were not symbolic amounts. For a man who had built his influence on the careful integration of legal and illegal assets, on owning or secretly controlling companies that could generate steady cash, while insulating him from direct exposure, the forced sale or shutdown of those enterprises struck directly at the foundation of his power. Publicly, prosecutors and FBI officials framed the results as a vindication of the strategy they had honed over the previous decade. Treat economic crime as seriously as more immediate offenses, and use RICO to show patterns rather than isolated acts. Carding associations that had once seemed unassailable trade groups now found themselves subject to consent decrees, close regulatory supervision, or, in some cases, dissolution. Union locals whose officers had long owed their positions to quiet underworld backing saw trustees, appointed to oversee their affairs and audits launched to trace missing funds. The old informal rule that certain lines of business belonged to certain families no longer carried the same untouchable weight in the face of sustained federal pressure. Inside prison, these developments reached Matthew in the form of legal mail, court transcripts, and the occasional newspaper clipping. The exact details of his day-to-day life behind bars are not well documented in public sources, but the outlines follow patterns common to high-profile organized crime inmates of his generation. He was housed in federal penitentiaries and medium security facilities where, despite his age and war injuries, he was classified as a significant security concern because of his underworld status. Contact with other inmates from the Genovese family and allied groups was not prohibited outright, but it was monitored. Visits from relatives and approved friends were regulated and recorded. Telephone calls could be listened to and, in some cases, transcribed. Prison administrators, increasingly familiar with the ways in which mob leaders had historically used their time in custody to keep issuing orders, tried to limit his ability to direct affairs on the street. Regulations restricted his access to business records. Conversations with lawyers, though legally privileged, were subject to some scrutiny to ensure they focused on actual legal matters rather than serving as coded channels for organizational directives. Even with these measures, completely severing such a figure from his old networks was difficult. Men who visited him, or who passed through the same institutions, carried back impressions to the outside world. Word of how he conducted himself in prison, whether he remained loyal to old rules, whether he complained, whether he seemed resigned or defiant, filtered back through the grapevine and shaped how younger members of the organization regarded him. By all accounts available in law enforcement and journalistic sources, he maintained the silence expected of an older generation mafia member. He did not become a cooperating witness. He did not appear before grand juries to describe the inner workings of the Genovese family. For prosecutors, this was hardly surprising. He had come up in an era when violation of the code of omerta was not simply discouraged, but severely punished. For him personally, having chosen in earlier cases to endure prison rather than assist the government revering course in old age would have represented a dramatic break with the identity he had built. Instead, he adapted to the constrained reality of institutional life. His circle of influence necessarily narrowed but not entirely extinguished in the cultural memory of the underworld. Outside, the world he had helped shape moved on. The 1990s brought fresh blows to traditional organized crime in New York. New generations of prosecutors, building on the precedents established in cases against figures like Matthew and his contemporaries, pursued RICO indictments against dozens of high-ranking members of all 5 major families. The persuasive power of earlier convictions, upheld on appeal, made judges more comfortable with the idea of treating loosely structured criminal associations as enterprises under the law. Cooperating witnesses, drawn from younger ranks less steeped in the old code and more disillusioned by the diminishing rewards and increasing risks of mob life, provided detailed insider narratives that reinforced the paper evidence assembled by investigators. For the Genovese family, this meant a gradual but real transformation. The image it had cultivated of a disciplined, quiet organization less prone to high-profile betrayals than some of its rivals was challenged by the steady stream of plea agreements and testimonies that emerged from federal courthouses. High-ranking leaders, including Vincent Chin, Gigant, long suspected of being the true power behind the family while others served as fronts, were finally convicted in the 1990s on racketeering and obstruction of justice charges. With each conviction, the ability of the old guard to coordinate complex citywide rackets weakened. In that changing environment, the specific niches that Matthew had once dominated also evolved. Times Square, which in his prime had been a patchwork of small, often seedy independent operations under the quiet guidance of his crew, became the focus of an aggressive urban renewal campaign. City officials, real estate developers, and corporate investors pushed for zoning changes, police crackdowns, and large-scale redevelopment projects. Adult entertainment venues, which had once been scattered across the area, were squeezed by new zoning rules into more remote corners of the city or closed altogether. Family-oriented tourist attractions, chain restaurants, and corporate theaters replaced many of the mom-and-pop operations that had been willing, or compelled, to do business with his network. In the waste hauling sector, sustained enforcement efforts produced a similarly mixed legacy. The most overtly cartelized associations were broken up or forced to accept external oversight. New companies entered the market, offering sometimes lower prices and more transparent contracts. Yet the habits formed over decades did not vanish overnight. Some firms carried forward informal relationships with individuals tied, directly or indirectly, to the old families. For regulators, ensuring that real competition took hold remained a long-term challenge. Still, the era when a figure like Matthew could, through a combination of union ties and street muscle, claim effective veto power over who collected trash from large swaths of businesses was largely over. From the perspective of legal history, his succession of convictions in the 1980s and early 1990s marked an important turning point in how courts and prosecutors understood organized crime. Earlier efforts focused heavily on spectacular acts of violence or on punishing individual bribery or extortion incidents had struggled to capture the systemic nature of the enterprise. His cases, by contrast, invited juries to see patterns. The same names and corporations recurring across multiple bars, the same methods used to control both gay nightlife in Greenwich Village and trash routes in Connecticut, the same blend of intimidation and seemingly ordinary contracts. When appellate courts upheld those convictions and the legal theories behind them, they laid down markers that subsequent RICO cases would follow. For Matthew personally, however, the effect was far more concrete. The incremental sentences, the fines, and the forfeitures added up to a reality in which, as he moved into his 70s, his chances of returning to anything resembling his former life grew increasingly slim. Family members aged or passed away. The Queens neighborhood where Matty's Towncrest had once served as a kind of informal headquarters changed, as did Little Italy and Times Square. New laws and enforcement patterns made it harder to operate the kind of cash-based, front-owner-dependent systems on which he had built his reputation. Younger men in the organization, even those who respected his legacy, pursued different kinds of opportunities, often in less visible, more diversified financial crimes. The details of his later years behind bars are sparse in public records, but certain facts stand out. He remained a federal inmate through the 1990s and into the 2000s, his projected release date pushed back by the accumulation of sentences and the complexity of federal parole and good time credit rules. Health issues associated with age and his old war injuries became more pressing. Like many older prisoners, he likely spent more time in medical units, less in general population. The man who had once overseen bustling bars filled with music and clinking glasses now navigated a regimented world of head counts, institutional meals, and tightly scheduled visits. Occasionally, his name resurfaced in news stories about new organized crime indictments, not because he was a fresh defendant, but because prosecutors or witnesses would refer to his era as a point of comparison. Younger defendants were described as inheriting what was left of the rackets he had run. Journalists writing retrospectives on the transformation of Times Square or on the history of gay bars in New York would mention him as a key figure in the Underworld's management of those spaces in the 1960s and 1970s. In this way, his influence lingered in the public record even as his direct involvement in current events diminished. By the time he finally approached the possibility of release, the world beyond the prison walls bore little resemblance to the one in which he had risen. The waterfronts had been redeveloped, old union halls had new leadership or had lost much of their former clout, and electronic surveillance and digital financial records had altered the risks and rewards of illicit enterprise. For an aging man who had built his life on face-to-face meetings in social clubs and back rooms, the age of security cameras and computerized audits was foreign territory. Whatever time remained to him outside would necessarily be spent not as an active architect of rackets, but as one of the last living links to a chapter of New York's underworld that was, by then, receding inexorably into history. When Matthew Ianniello finally walked out of federal custody after his first long stretch on racketeering convictions, he stepped into a city that was both recognizably New York and strangely altered. The skyline had grown, but so had security cameras and metal gates. Some of the dingy bars and neon-lit clubs that had once been the backbone of his earnings were gone, replaced by chain restaurants or boarded-up storefronts awaiting redevelopment. He was no longer the stocky man in late middle age who had gone away in the mid-1980s. He was an older inmate with a damaged eye, a stiff gait, and a long paper trail linking his name to some of the most carefully built RICO cases in the country. His release did not mean freedom in any expansive sense. As a federal parolee, and later as an older man on supervised release, he faced strict conditions. He was prohibited from associating with convicted felons and known organized crime figures. His contacts with labor unions and liquor-licensed businesses were supposed to be limited and reported. He had to meet regularly with probation or parole officers, account for his income, and obtain permission for significant travel. Any hint that he was re-engaging in the conduct that had led to his convictions could trigger a return to prison. Yet his reputation did not vanish with the signature of a parole certificate. Within law enforcement circles and the underworld alike, he was still Matty the Horse, the man whose silence during earlier prosecutions had been noted and in some quarters respected. The Genovese family he had served for decades was reeling from its own succession of legal blows, but it was not dismantled. Its older leaders had died or were imprisoned. Its younger members were looking for guidance in a changing environment. FBI reports from the 1990s, later cited in court filings and news stories, repeatedly named him as part of the family's unofficial administration, a senior advisor or acting boss at various points as visible leaders cycled through indictments and sentences. These assessments were based on more than just his history. Surveillance in the early and mid-1990 captured him meeting in restaurants and social clubs with figures identified as Genovese captains and soldiers, as well as with union officials and businessmen in sectors long associated with the family's influence. Agents observed him in unremarkable suburban settings as often as in the old Manhattan haunts. Long Island diners, quiet Queens cafes, and sit-down Italian restaurants in Westchester or Connecticut served as the new backdrop for conversations that, in a different era, might have taken place in dark Little Italy back rooms. The content of those meetings, filtered through wiretap transcripts and informant reports, suggested that his focus had shifted with the city around him. Times Square, once a core revenue engine, was under sustained political and legal attack. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, elected in 1993, made the clean-up of the area a public priority. Zoning changes limited where adult entertainment businesses could operate. Police crackdowns targeted street-level prostitution, unlicensed vendors, and quality-of-life offenses. Major real estate developers, backed by city policy, began converting older theaters and shabby office buildings into tourist-friendly attractions and corporate spaces. The small operators who had once run peep show arcades or topless bars under Genovese oversight found their rents rising, their licenses under pressure, and their neighborhoods transformed. In that environment, the old model, relying heavily on a dense concentration of small cash businesses in a few square blocks, became less reliable. According to law enforcement analyses at the time, the Genovese family diversified more aggressively into areas that were less visible to tourists but no less lucrative. Construction subcontracting, building maintenance, garment and trucking unions, and service sectors tied to the region's ongoing growth. The skills that Matthew had honed, managing union relationships, using seemingly legitimate companies as fronts, and smoothing disputes among competing interests, were still useful, even if the setting had changed. Investigators tracking these developments in the 1990s increasingly saw his name surface in contexts far removed from the bars and clubs that had once defined his public image. There were references to meetings with officials from locals representing hotel and restaurant employees, but also to contacts with unions covering building service workers and certain construction trades. Some of these locals were later the subject of civil racketeering suits or consent decrees aimed at removing corrupt influence. In court papers and in testimony by cooperating witnesses, prosecutors would argue that men like Matthew, drawing on decades of experience, acted as behind-the-scenes brokers, ensuring that key posts remained in friendly hands and that contract negotiations produced outcomes favorable to companies under mob influence. At the same time, the balance of fear and loyalty that had long sustained Omerta was shifting. Younger members of the crime families, facing the prospect of 20 or 30-year sentences under RICO, proved more willing than their predecessors to cooperate with the government. Beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating into the 1990s, a string of former soldiers and even some captains entered witness protection in exchange for detailed testimony. Their accounts filled in gaps that surveillance could not. They described internal promotion decisions, the logic behind assignments to particular rackets, and the informal but powerful role of senior figures like Matthew in arbitrating disputes. From these overlapping sources, a portrait emerged of an aging but still influential operator. He did not dash from crisis to crisis. He received visitors. Reports described midday meals where a succession of men would arrive, each taking a turn at the table to discuss a problem, a contested waste hauling contract, a dispute over which company would supply concrete to a project, a question about how to respond to a union member demanding more transparency. He offered advice, conveyed messages from higher authorities when they existed, and in some cases made the final call himself. His rank, variously labeled by law enforcement as acting boss, acting underboss, or senior advisor, depending on the exact period, reflected the fluidity of a family under constant legal attack, but his centrality remained a constant. For the government, the question was not whether he was still active, but how to translate that activity into cases that could overcome the legal and evidentiary hurdles that had grown steeper since his earlier convictions. RICO prosecutions now faced more experienced defense counsel and judges wary of overbroad theories. Prosecutors needed concrete acts, recorded extortionate conversations, documented sham contracts, or clear misappropriation of union funds. Gathering that kind of evidence against a man who had already been the target of multiple major investigations, and who knew well the risks of careless talk, required patience. Technology, however, was on their side. By the mid-1990s and early 2000s, hidden microphones and cameras were smaller and more reliable than those used in the 1970s. Court-authorized wiretaps extended not only to landlines, but to cellular phones, though cautious mob figures were slow to adopt the new technology. In some cases, undercover agents posed as businessmen seeking entry into markets traditionally controlled by the Genovese family. When they were steered toward intermediaries who invoked Matthew's name or claimed the need to check with the old man, before approving a deal, those statements, captured on tape, fed into a growing dossier. Meanwhile, the larger narrative about some of the worlds he had once controlled was being rewritten in the public sphere. The Stonewall Uprising of 1969, which during his prime had been a local disturbance in one of many bars he and his colleagues profited from, became, by the 1990s, an internationally recognized landmark in the struggle for LGBTQ rights. Documentaries, academic studies, and memoirs explored not only the bravery of the patrons who resisted police harassment, but also the economic backdrop, how organized crime had dominated gay bars in an era of legal hostility, extracting profits without offering real security. In that retelling, figures like Matthew appeared not as colorful rogues, but as reinforcing a structure of exploitation layered atop state discrimination. Historians of labor and urban crime similarly reassessed the mid-century patterns of union control and racketeering he had helped shape. Where earlier coverage might have cast him as a single powerful mobster, exercising personal sway, later studies highlighted the systemic nature of the arrangements, the intertwining of weak regulatory oversight, employer complicity, and criminal enforcement. They examined how, in industries like hospitality and carding, his brand of influence had raised costs, distorted competition, and eroded trust in both unions and businesses. Court records from his trials, once ephemeral, were mined for details that illuminated broader trends. There is little evidence in the public record about how he received this shifting judgment of his era. In interviews, prosecutors and defense attorneys who had dealt with him over the years described him in similar terms: courteous in person, careful with his words, rarely emotional in public settings. He was not given to self-justifying statements in the press or in court. When he spoke in allocutions, formal statements during plea hearings, it was usually to acknowledge the elements necessary to satisfy the law without elaborating on motives or personal philosophy. Those who hoped he might one day provide an insider's memoir of the Genovese family and his own role in it were disappointed. He maintained the reticence that had marked his climb. What can be traced are the continued efforts by law enforcement to hold him accountable for activities that, in some cases, stretched well beyond the period covered by his earlier convictions. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, multi-agency task forces focused on the lingering reach of the Genovese family in construction, waste management, and certain unions. Reports from the FBI, the U.S. Department of Labor, and local prosecutors increasingly converged on the conclusion that, despite prior blows, The family still collected illicit payments from contractors and controlled key decision-makers in some locals. In those reports, his name reappeared, not as the only architect of these schemes, but as one of the senior figures whose approval or guidance was routinely sought. Gradually, these investigations coalesced into new sets of charges that would pull him back into the orbit of federal courthouses. Unlike the sweeping mid-1980s case that had centered on Times Square nightlife, the new indictments were more targeted, reflecting both lessons learned and the narrower scope of some remaining rackets. Prosecutors in New York and Connecticut alleged that, even in his 70s and 80s, he had played a role in extorting payments from companies in construction and waste-hauling fields, and in facilitating the placement of Genovese loyalists in union posts that controlled lucrative benefit funds and contract rights. When he was summoned once again to stand before a judge, the contrast with his first major RICO trial decades earlier was stark. Gone was the relatively vigorous man in his 60s listening impassively as prosecutors summarized his activities. In his place stood, or sometimes sat, an elderly defendant whose age and visible frailty were impossible to ignore. News accounts of these later proceedings described him using a cane or being assisted by family members, his once imposing physical presence diminished by time. Yet the underlying accusations were not softened by his age. Court documents still labeled him an important member, even an acting leader, of a criminal enterprise that had inflicted real economic harm over many years. Confronted with this combination of advancing years and accumulating evidence, he chose in these later cases not to contest the charges at trial. He entered guilty pleas to racketeering counts that summarized his role in extortion and labor corruption schemes reaching into the 1990s and early 2000s. As in earlier allocutions, he acknowledged the elements necessary to support the convictions without offering a broader narrative. Judges, weighing sentencing factors that included his age, his health, and his prior criminal record, imposed additional prison terms and fines. While some of these sentences were shorter than those he had received in his 60s, reflecting both sentencing guidelines and a recognition that a decade in prison meant something different to a man in his 80s than to a man in midlife. They nonetheless ensured that his final years would be shaped once more by institutional routines. These later cases underscored an uncomfortable reality for those who study the history of organized crime and its regulation: the tenacity with which some patterns of behavior and control persist, even in the face of aggressive enforcement. For nearly half a century, from the post-war period through the dawn of the 21st century, Matthew had found ways to adapt his role to changing legal, economic, and urban conditions. Nightclubs and gay bars gave way to waste-hauling routes and construction contracts. Informal social clubs receded as meeting places, replaced by more anonymous public locations. The essential logic, using the threat of disruption and the promise of stability to extract value from others' enterprises, remained. By the time these final convictions were entered, public perception of him had largely solidified. To some, he was an emblematic figure in the long saga of New York's mafia, a man who rose from impoverished immigrant roots, served bravely in war, and then spent his life harnessing that same resilience and discipline to enforce an illegal order that siphoned wealth from the city around him. To others, he was a cautionary example of how the state, for too long, had tolerated and sometimes quietly accommodated such figures, only gradually mustering the legal tools and political will necessary to confront them fully. Inside the prison system where he returned yet again, he was now part of a small cohort of very elderly, organized crime inmates. Correctional staff dealing with him had often not been born when he first entered the Genovese orbit. For them, he was a case file involving high-profile racketeering and the practical challenges of caring for an aging population behind bars, arranging medical appointments, handling medications, and eventually dealing with the physical and cognitive decline that accompany advanced age. The distance between the young laborer earning the nickname, the Horse, for his stamina and the old man shuffling through institutional corridors was vast, yet the legal record connected those two images in a continuous thread. Outside, historians, journalists, and filmmakers continued to mine his life for insights into the evolution of American organized crime. Some focused on his role in specific episodes: the management of gay bars before and after Stonewall, the politics of Times Square's transformation, the intricacies of carding cartels. Others placed him within a broader generational story, the last of the World War II era bosses, whose formative experiences had been shaped by the Depression, the war, and the great post-war migration to the suburbs. In that framing, his persistence into the early 21st century appeared both anachronistic and instructive, a reminder that the legacies of earlier eras can linger long after the social and economic conditions that spawned them have changed. As his various sentences ran their course and the calendar moved deeper into the new century, the possibility of his spending any substantial time as a free man again grew increasingly slim. And yet, as with many federal inmates of his age, questions of compassionate release, medical necessity, and the proportionality of continuing to incarcerate very old prisoners arose. These debates unfolded not only in courtrooms, where motions cited declining health and the diminished risk of reoffending, but also in a public arena increasingly attuned to the costs and consequences of long-term imprisonment. The man at the center of these questions, however, remained largely silent, his voice heard only in the formal, measured tones of legal filings and brief in-court statements, as the story of his life and crimes moved slowly from present-day controversy into the realm of historical record. In the early years of the new century, court calendars and prison rosters still carried the name Matthew Ianniello, but the man they referred to was no longer the energetic figure who had once paced through Times Square bars and union halls. He was in his 80s, with decades of incarceration behind him and more time ahead. Judges reviewing new racketeering cases saw a defendant whose biography stretched back to the Second World War and forward through some of the most ambitious organized crime prosecutions in American history. To them, he was proof that older patterns of behavior could persist stubbornly, even as the legal and economic landscape changed around them. The last major investigations that drew him back into court centered once again on the intersection of labor, transportation, and essential city services. Federal and state task forces looking into the waste hauling industry and related sectors had learned from earlier cases. They no longer treated cartels in commercial trash collection as a parochial problem of crooked local businesses, but as part of a broader system in which organized crime families, complicit employers, and compromised union officials all played roles. In that system, someone like Matthew, even in advanced age, could still be valuable as a symbol of continuity and as an arbiter when disputes arose. Surveillance in the early 2000s, supported by cooperating witnesses who had grown weary of the constant pressure to pay for peace, documented conversations in which company owners were reminded that certain routes, customers, or contracts were spoken for. It captured union officers discussing how to steer benefit funds or job assignments in ways that favored firms known to be paying off the right intermediaries. In some of those exchanges, participants invoked Matthew's name, sometimes as an authority whose approval needed to be sought, sometimes as a shorthand for the Genovese family's long-standing claim to particular territories and industries. The resulting indictments, filed in federal courts in New York and Connecticut, charged him and others with racketeering acts that included extortion and illegal control of labor organizations. Prosecutors alleged that, even while nominally retired, he had participated in schemes that coerced waste hauling companies into paying regular sums, and that helped keep union leadership aligned with the interests of the Genovese family, rather than with their rank and file members. The picture they painted was not of a mastermind orchestrating every move, but of an elder statesman whose continued presence lent weight to threats, and whose quiet nod could settle questions of who had the right to profit from a given slice of the market. In courtroom appearances during these final cases, observers were struck by the contrast between the accusations and the defendant's physical condition. Matthew, now in his mid-80s, appeared visibly frail. He moved slowly, sometimes with assistance. The war injury that had cost him an eye decades earlier, once a vivid symbol of his toughness, now blended into the general toll of age. Yet federal sentencing law, shaped in part by the very kind of racketeering prosecutions that had ensnared him in the 1980s, left judges with limited room to treat advanced age as an all-purpose mitigation. He chose not to contest these final charges at trial. Through plea agreements negotiated by his attorneys, he admitted to participating in racketeering enterprises that had extorted payments from companies in the trash-hauling and construction-related fields, and had corrupted labor representation in those industries. In allocutions, he acknowledged that he had conspired with others to use the implied threat of economic harm to compel payments and cooperation, and that these acts violated federal law. He did not, however, offer a broader reflection on his life or motivations. As in earlier court appearances, he spoke just enough to satisfy the legal requirements and then fell silent. The sentences that followed were measured in years, but they were heavy in context. An additional term of a few years, imprisonment can look modest on paper. For a man in his 80s, it may represent most of the time he has left. Judges also imposed fines and ordered further forfeiture of assets tied to the schemes, reinforcing the principle that the economic base of organized crime had to be attacked along with its personnel. To prosecutors who had spent their careers studying the long arc of his activities, there was a sense of historical closure in seeing the same name that had appeared on indictments in the 1970s and 1980s, still facing consequences in the 21st century. Behind prison walls, Matthew Wright's world contracted once again. Where earlier incarcerations had occurred in institutions filled with men closer to his own age and background, this time he was part of a much older cohort. The federal prison system, like many others, had seen its population age as long sentences accumulated. Medical units were busier, and correctional officers increasingly found themselves attending to inmates with chronic illnesses and mobility problems. For Matthew, whose health had already been shaped by wartime wounds and years of institutional life, the transition back into custody for what would likely be his final stretch must have been especially stark. Little is recorded publicly about his day-to-day experience in these last years behind bars, but the broad contours can be inferred from similar cases. He would have undergone regular medical evaluations, with treatment provided either on site or at outside hospitals under guard. His eligibility for programs open to younger prisoners, job training, prison industries, certain educational courses, was limited by his age and health. Interaction with other inmates remained, but the social hierarchies that once elevated men with strong underworld reputations had thinned as newer generations arrived with different priorities and connections. Outside, the world he had moved through so confidently in midlife continued to recede. Times Square's transformation into a highly branded entertainment district was largely complete. National chain stores and corporate theaters dominated corners where, in his day, small independent bars and clubs had once negotiated their survival through quiet deals with men like him. The city's commercial trash-hauling industry, while still subject to scandals and investigations, operated under closer regulatory scrutiny, with specialized commissions created in part because of the revelations that emerged from his and others' cases. Unions that had once been seen as near-permanent strongholds of mob influence experienced leadership turnovers, federal monitorships, or, in some cases, membership decline that reduced the stakes of controlling them. Historians and journalists, taking advantage of newly accessible court records and declassified investigative files, began to write more fully integrated narratives of the era he had helped shape. In accounts of the Stonewall Uprising, his name appeared as part of the underworld infrastructure that had profited from gay bars while leaving patrons exposed to police raids and public outing. Studies of labor racketeering cited his cases as classic examples of how organized crime exploited the tension between employers and unions, inserting itself as an unofficial arbiter whose solutions enriched the few at the expense of many. Analyses of Times Square's long decline and eventual redevelopment treated his control of adult entertainment venues not as a colorful footnote, but as a factor in the area's reputation and political fate. Eventually, age and health caught up with him in a way the legal system could not ignore. Motions were filed seeking modifications to his confinement based on medical considerations, citing his advanced years and deteriorating condition. Federal judges, guided by statutes and policies that allow for compassionate release or transfers to less restrictive forms of custody in cases of serious illness, weighed these requests against his criminal history and the principle that sentences, once imposed, should not be lightly disturbed. The balance tipped, as it increasingly does in such cases, toward recognizing that the risks posed by a severely ill octogenarian were not the same as those posed by a comparatively vigorous man in his 60s. In the late 2000s, as he approached his 90th year, he was released from federal custody for the last time. Exact dates and conditions, while a matter of public record in court dockets, drew less media coverage than his earlier releases. The novelty of seeing him walk out of prison had faded. He returned not to the dense tenement blocks of his youth, nor to the bustling Queens restaurant that had once been his base, but to a quiet house in Old Westbury, on Long Island's North Shore, an area long associated with affluent suburban living. There he spent his final years under forms of supervision that reflected both the seriousness of his past and the practical recognition that his ability to rebuild old networks was sharply limited by age. Neighbors who spoke to reporters after his death described an elderly man who kept a low profile. To those who did not know his history, he might have appeared to be a retired businessman or war veteran enjoying a late in life calm. Those aware of his background saw instead a man who had spent much of his adulthood wielding influence through bars, unions, and carting firms, now quietly living out his remaining time. Law enforcement agencies, though they maintained a residual interest in any contact he might have with known associates, dedicated their primary resources to younger figures still actively engaged in crime. On August 22, 2012, Matthew Joseph Ianniello died at his home in Old Westbury at the age of 90-2. News of his death appeared in obituaries and crime columns that emphasized the arc of his life: his birth in Manhattan's Italian neighborhoods in 1920, his decorated service in the U.S. Army during the Second World War, his rise through the Genovese crime family, his role as a key manager of gay bars, Times Square clubs, and waste-hauling rackets, and the long succession of convictions that had kept him in and out of federal prisons for more than a quarter century. Former prosecutors and law enforcement officials offered measured comments, describing him as intelligent, disciplined, and above all, persistent. The obituaries also underscored the stark contradictions that had defined his public identity. On one side stood the image of the soldier wounded in the Pacific, awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, a testament to courage under fire in service to his country. On the other stood the record of a man who had spent decades using threats and corrupt influence to extract money from small business owners, union members, and marginalized communities. For some readers, the juxtaposition invited speculation about how those experiences connected. Whether the discipline and hierarchy of the military had made the structure of a crime family feel familiar, or whether the shock of returning from war to a society where prejudice and economic limits persisted had nudged him toward the alternative authority systems of the underworld. Those closest to the harms caused by his activities, workers in unions whose leadership was compromised, owners of bars and restaurants who had been compelled to take on silent partners or pay unearned fees, patrons of gay bars who had been overcharged and left unprotected, viewed his death through a different lens. In their stories, relayed to journalists and researchers in subsequent years, his name represented not a personal villain so much as the embodiment of a system in which legitimate avenues of recourse were blocked, leaving people vulnerable both to police crackdowns and to exploitation by organized crime. When discussing the bad old days of rigged contracts, skimmed union funds, and precarious nightlife, they often spoke less about any individual mobster and more about the pervasive sense that the rules were written elsewhere and that enforcement, if it came, would not be on their side. For historians, his passing marked the symbolic end of a particular generation within American organized crime. He belonged to the cohort of men who had been born in the first quarter of the 20th century, who had grown up in immigrant families during the Depression, served in the armed forces during the Second World War, and then applied the skills and outlook formed in that crucible to the opportunities and constraints of post-war urban America. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he survived into old age, long enough to see the worlds he had navigated so effectively, dockside unions, cash-based nightlife, unregulated carting, undergo profound legal and economic transformation. In the years following his death, his life continued to be examined in books, documentaries, and academic articles. Scholars of LGBTQ history used his control of bars like the Stonewall Inn to illustrate how organized crime had taken advantage of discriminatory liquor laws and social stigma, inserting itself as a gatekeeper to spaces of community and resistance. They pointed out that while his operations had, in a narrow sense, enabled the existence of such bars at a time when they were often shut down as a matter of policy, the primary beneficiaries were those at the top of the financial chain, not the patrons who risked arrest or exposure when raids occurred. Labor historians and criminologists explored his role in union corruption and racketeering, situating it within broader debates about the relationship between organized crime and organized labor. They emphasized that his brand of influence did not invent conflicts between workers and employers, but exploited them, turning mechanisms intended to protect wages and benefits into tools for siphoning money and enforcing silence. They also highlighted how the successful prosecutions brought against him and his associates had led to concrete reforms, strengthened oversight of benefit funds, more rigorous monitoring of union elections, and the creation of specialized agencies to vet companies seeking contracts in historically compromised industries. Legal scholars, in turn, analyzed the cases that bore his name, especially the 1980s RICO prosecutions, as landmarks in the development of racketeering law. The appellate decisions that upheld his convictions clarified how prosecutors could define an enterprise, how they could demonstrate a pattern of racketeering acts, and how courts should interpret the forfeiture provisions of RICO. These rulings shaped not only subsequent organized crime cases, but also civil and criminal RICO actions in fields as diverse as corporate fraud and public corruption. In that sense, the legal legacy of his life extended far beyond the confines of the underworld he had inhabited. In public memory, however, he remained a more ambivalent figure. For some, especially in the neighborhoods where his influence had once been strongest, he was recalled in fragments, stories of a man who could make unions back off a small business, or who could ensure that a relative found work, or who quietly paid for a community event. Such anecdotes, common in the oral histories of organized crime areas, hint at the complex ways in which figures like him embedded themselves in local life. Yet even those who shared such stories often framed them against the larger backdrop of fear, economic distortion, and lost opportunity that accompanied mob domination of key sectors. The arc of his life, from a boy in a crowded Manhattan tenement to an old man dying in a suburban house after years in federal custody, offers a lens on the broader forces that shaped 20th century New York. It reflects the struggles of immigrant families seeking security in a society that sometimes excluded them, the impact of global conflict on individual trajectories, the temptations and distortions of power available to those willing to operate outside the law, and the slow, often halting response of institutions to entrenched criminal enterprises. His story underscores that organized crime is not merely a collection of colorful characters or violent episodes, but a long-running interplay between economic structures, legal frameworks, and personal choices. In the end, the tension that hovered over his life, between service and exploitation, discipline and coercion, community ties and systemic harm, remains unresolved. His own voice, by design or habit, left little in the way of introspection on the record. What remains are the documents of courts and regulatory agencies, the testimonies of those who worked with or under him, and the memories of those whose lives were altered, in ways large and small, by the webs of control he helped spin. From those materials, the historical picture that emerges is not one of a tragic antihero or a romantic outlaw, but of a highly capable organizer who chose to apply his talents to building and maintaining structures that, over time, inflicted substantial damage on the social and economic life of the city he called home. After Matthew Ianniello's death in 2012, the story that had once unfolded mainly in courtrooms and on investigative files began to settle into the slower rhythms of historical interpretation. For the first time in nearly 70 years, there was no living version of Matty the Horse out there. No aging defendant shuttling between federal facilities and supervised release. No quiet presence at the corner table of a suburban restaurant watched discreetly by surveillance teams. What remained were documents, memories, and the city he had helped shape in ways that were often invisible while he was at work. Within law enforcement circles, his name shifted from an operational concern to a case study. Younger FBI agents and federal prosecutors, who had come of age after the Great Commission trials of the 1980s, now encountered him primarily in training sessions and thick printouts of earlier indictments. Senior agents who had helped build the RICO cases of the 1980s and 1990s would point to his file as an example of how a patient investigation could move from fragmentary intelligence, whispers about bar ownership, unexplained payments in union locals, to a coherent narrative of enterprise-wide criminal conduct. They emphasized that his prosecutions had not rested on Hollywood-style revelations, but on tax returns, corporate records, surveillance logs, and the willingness of a few insiders to explain how those pieces fit together. The legal opinions that had once marked the turning points of his life acquired a second existence in law school classrooms and treatises. Appellate decisions upholding his RICO convictions were quoted for what they said about the definition of an enterprise, the meaning of a pattern of racketeering activity, and the scope of criminal forfeiture. Judges and scholars debating the reach of RICO into areas like corporate fraud and public corruption invoked his cases as part of the statute's origin story, evidence that Congress had intended to give prosecutors a tool to dismantle long-standing criminal structures, not just punish isolated offenses. In this retelling, he appeared less as a uniquely dangerous individual than as a representative figure whose career illustrated why such a tool had been deemed necessary. Outside legal and law enforcement communities, his legacy was filtered through other lenses. For Italian-American organizations that had spent decades pushing back against the equation of their heritage with organized crime, his life was a double-edged reference point. On one hand, he confirmed the historical reality that, for much of the 20th century, Some men from Italian immigrant communities had indeed built powerful criminal networks. On the other, his story also highlighted the conditions that had made that path attractive or possible for a subset of young men in the 1930s and 1940s. Entrenched discrimination, economic barriers, and the presence of older, already organized criminal structures offering an alternative route to respect and income. Community leaders and historians from within those neighborhoods used his biography to complicate simplistic narratives. They stressed that for every Matthew Ianniello, there were thousands of Italian-American veterans who returned from the Second World War and built lives in factories, small businesses, classrooms, and public service. They noted that his ability to claim authority in bars, unions, and trucking firms depended on the participation, or at least the acquiescence, of non-Italian actors, employers looking for shortcuts, corrupt officials, and consumers willing to shrug at the mob, so long as visible violence remained low and services were delivered. In that wider context, his rise looked less like an ethnic inevitability and more like a symptom of how American cities handled, or failed to handle, the regulation of cash-heavy industries and labor relations. In LGBTQ history, his presence remained deeply ambivalent. The Stonewall Inn, the most famous bar linked to his network, was by the 21st century a designated national monument and the subject of extensive scholarship. Activists, historians, and community elders revisited the late 1960s and early 1970s with a critical eye not only toward the police, but also toward the underworld figures who had dominated gay nightlife in that era. They described how organized crime, including the Genovese family through Matthew Wright's operations, stepped into a space created by homophobic law and policy. When authorities treated bars serving gay patrons as unlicensable or inherently suspect, legitimate entrepreneurs largely stayed away. Mob-linked operators provided what the state would not, semi-public spaces where queer people could gather, but did so on terms designed to maximize profit and minimize their own risk. Accounts of Stonewall and similar venues made clear that this arrangement left patrons doubly vulnerable. On one side, they faced police raids, arrests, and the threat of public exposure at a time when being identified as gay or lesbian could mean job loss, eviction, or violence. On the other, they dealt with poor conditions, blackmail threats, and arbitrary treatment inside establishments whose ultimate owners were concerned above all with cash flow and avoiding direct legal exposure. In this framework, Matthew appeared not as a clandestine ally who had bravely defied unjust laws on behalf of an oppressed group, but as a businessman who recognized a niche rendered profitable precisely because its customers had so few protected options. Labor historians, too, folded his story into broader analyses of post-war unionism and corruption. They traced how men like him had learned to read the power map of the workplace, understanding that whoever controlled hearing halls, grievance procedures, and benefit funds could shape not just wages, but the everyday lives of thousands of workers. Through case studies of hotel and restaurant locals, building service unions, and carting-related locals in which he played a role, they documented the techniques used to bend those institutions toward organized crime's benefit. Installing loyalists in key posts, skimming from health and pension funds, making sure that strike decisions aligned with the interests of favored employers, and punishing rank-and-file dissent. From that vantage point, his influence looked less like the cartoonish image of a mobster, owning a union, and more like a long-term, corrosive pressure that hollowed out institutions from within. Workers still received paychecks, contracts were still negotiated, and benefits were still dispersed, but the gap between what might have been achieved in a clean system and what was actually delivered represented a hidden tax paid by some of the city's most vulnerable residents. That tax took the form of lower benefits, weaker job security, and a pervasive sense that raising one's voice could be dangerous. Matthew Wright, S. repeated convictions on labor-racketeering counts gave these analyses a firm factual anchor, turning what might have been dismissed as ideological critique into a story grounded in courtroom findings and sworn testimony. Urban historians examining the transformation of New York itself found in his trajectory a thread that connected several of the city's most dramatic mid-century changes. His early ventures in Queens restaurants and Manhattan bars aligned with the outward spread of Italian-American communities and the growth of a working-class, GI-driven consumer culture. His later dominance of Times Square nightlife paralleled the area's decline from a symbol of Broadway glamour to a byword for seedy entertainment, an evolution shaped by suburbanization, disinvestment, and permissive zoning that created openings for the adult businesses his network controlled. When the pendulum swung again in the 1990s and 2000s, with aggressive efforts to clean up Times Square and reclaim it for large corporate tenants and tourists, commentators noted the irony that some of the same policymaking indifference that had allowed mob influence to flourish in earlier decades had indirectly helped set the stage for the argument that only drastic redevelopment could save the district. In that sense, his control of adult theaters, peep shows, and strip clubs in and around Times Square was not merely an episode in criminal history. It formed part of the backdrop against which a major urban planning and real-estate story unfolded. Looking back over the whole of his life, scholars often emphasize the persistent interplay between individual agency and structural forces. Matthew had made choices at every stage: to align himself with the Genovese family rather than pursue a wholly legal career, to use his wartime-home discipline to enforce underworld rules, to maintain silence when facing lengthy sentences instead of cooperating with prosecutors. Yet those choices had been made within a field of constraints and opportunities defined by the times. The tenements of his childhood, the limited educational prospects available to him, the patterns of employment that channeled him into physically demanding, low-status jobs. These were not unique to him, but part of the broader story of Southern Italian immigration and American industrial capitalism. None of this excused the harms caused by his later activities, but it did influence how historians weighed causation and responsibility. Rather than treating him as a singularly malevolent figure who had warped an otherwise healthy system, many writers framed him as one of the most capable exponents of an order that had taken shape before he was born, and that involved many actors beyond the men who took formal vows into crime families. Without landlords willing to lease properties through compliant front men, liquor regulators willing to overlook obvious signs of hidden ownership, police willing to accept envelopes in exchange for strategic inattention, and employers willing to cut deals that shortchanged workers, his range of motion would have been far narrower. At the same time, the contours of his story underscored how far institutions had come and how far they still had to go in responding to such embedded criminality. When he was a young man in the 1940s and 1950s, federal tools for confronting organized crime were rudimentary. Prosecutions tended to rely on direct evidence of specific acts, bookmaking, loan sharking, tax evasion. The idea of going after a mob figure on the theory that he belonged to a distinct enterprise, conducting its affairs through a pattern of racketeering acts, had not yet taken legal shape. By the time he died, RICO had become a central pillar of federal criminal law, and the kinds of schemes he had run, integrating nominally legitimate businesses into networks of extortion and fraud, stood as textbook examples in training manuals and casebooks. Debates about RICO's reach sometimes returned to his prosecutions as cautionary tales or touchstones. Civil libertarians worried that a statute crafted to break the power of entrenched crime families might, if interpreted too broadly, be misused against less clearly criminal organizations. Supporters countered that cases like his demonstrated both the necessity and the careful application of the law, Long-term patterns of economic exploitation, carried out through fear and deceit, had been exposed and punished only because prosecutors could present them as part of a coherent enterprise rather than scattered misdeeds. The moral complexity of his life, decorated soldier and lifelong racketeer, also invited reflection on the relationship between wartime experience and post-war criminality. Some commentators speculated that the rigors of combat and the discipline of military hierarchy might have made the structure of a mafia family feel familiar and even comforting to veterans like him. Others argued that the connection was overstated, noting that the vast majority of his fellow soldiers had returned and built lawful lives, and that organized crime offered distinct rewards, money, status, and a quasi-familial sense of belonging that appealed independently of any military background. Because he never publicly offered his own interpretation, these questions remained open, and responsible historians treated them as such. When they ventured explanations, they did so cautiously, anchoring conjecture in the concrete markers of his life. The early exit from school, the long hours of manual labor, the shattered eye and the medals, the first restaurant, the gradual deepening of his ties to the Genovese hierarchy. The absence of a confessional memoir or extended interviews spared the record from self-serving narratives, but also left room for competing readings of why, at key junctures, he turned in one direction rather than another. Popular culture, which has often drawn loosely on the histories of New York's crime families for films, novels, and television shows, referenced his world more than his person. The Genovese organization, under various fictionalized names, appeared as the template for disciplined, financially sophisticated mob groups whose leaders preferred negotiation and control of unions to flamboyant violence. Storylines involving gay bars under mob control, corrupt labor leaders in the hospitality industry, or garbage hauling cartels owed much to the historical record in which he figured. Yet in most cases, those works opted for composite characters rather than direct portrayals, blending elements of multiple real figures and events into drama. For viewers and readers, this blurring could obscure the specificities of his case, the ways in which his operations intersected with particular communities and legal developments. Serious documentaries and non-fiction works filled some of that gap, using court transcripts and investigative files to separate embellishment from documented fact. In those formats, he appeared not as a romantic anti-hero, but as what the record supports, a determined, detail-oriented man who learned how to leverage the weaknesses of institutions and the vulnerabilities of others for sustained gain. By the time a full century had passed since his birth, his life had become a reference point across multiple fields: criminology, labor studies, LGBTQ history, legal doctrine, and urban studies. Each discipline approached him with different questions, but all were forced to grapple with the same basic pattern: an individual whose choices cannot be disentangled from the structures that made those choices meaningful and effective. His story thus became a cautionary tale on several levels. It warned of what happens when regulatory bodies lack the tools or will to probe beneath surface ownership. It demonstrated how discrimination against one group, in this case, gay and lesbian New Yorkers, can create profitable niches for others to exploit. It showed how unions, vital to protecting workers, can be weakened from within when democratic practices are eroded and backroom deals become the norm. At the same time, the eventual unraveling of his enterprises offered evidence that change, while slow and costly, was possible. The combination of investigative persistence, legislative innovation, and shifting public norms eventually caught up with him. What had once been accepted as inevitable, mob influence over certain neighborhoods, industries, and unions, came to be seen as unacceptable and, crucially, addressable. The fact that it took multiple prosecutions across 3 decades to curtail his activities did not negate the significance of that shift. It underscored how deeply embedded such systems can become, and how sustained the response must be. In tracing his journey from a boy in a Manhattan immigrant household to a nonagenarian dying quietly in a Long Island suburb, the historical record resists simple verdicts of explanation or absolution. It instead presents a densely layered account of 20th century American life as refracted through one man's career. The rough edges of assimilation, the allure and cost of unsanctioned power, the long arc of law's adaptation to new forms of harm. The tension between his military decorations and his criminal convictions, between the local aid he sometimes offered and the broader damage he helped inflict, remains unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable. What can be said with clarity is that his life left marks far beyond the bars and businesses he directly touched. The reforms implemented in response to his rackets, the legal doctrines shaped in the course of prosecuting him, and the stories told by those who lived under his systems of control all continue to influence how cities regulate commerce, how unions safeguard their independence, how marginalized communities assess those who claim to offer protection, and how the law conceptualizes organized crime itself. In that sense, the legacy of Matthew Joseph Ianniello endures less in the fading memories of his nickname and more in the ongoing efforts to build institutions strong enough and fair enough to ensure that the particular blend of opportunity and impunity he once enjoyed is harder for anyone to reproduce.